All right, if it's just the three of us, that's what it'll be. So be it. All right, let's do pay attention because last exam, some people who were actually here in the class said exactly the opposite of what I said during the lecture. So try to stay focused, take notes, the usual stuff, just like we were in a real room together. So anyway, this is a big chapter, and the answers to the questions are not obvious. And if you, which I don't think either one of you would do, if you just go to the internet to try to get answers, once again, you're likely to get the wrong ones. So there it is. This is important because this tells us a lot about how things work. And so these are things worth knowing, because you will hear all kinds of na-na throughout your lifetime about why things are happening in the economy. So government plays a big role in the economy. So make a note of this. Fiscal policy, monetary policy, and regulation. I can't tell you, in all the years I've been teaching this, and as often as I say exactly that, people, when they try to answer the question, will say something else. So don't be those students, okay? So fiscal policy is basically government spending money and raising taxes. Monetary policy is control of the money supply, and regulation is just as it sounds, saying you can do this and you can't do that. And so we'll talk a little more about each one of these things as we go along. So fiscal policy. Government spends money. Government spends a lot of money. Every government spends a lot of money, and that has a big impact on the economy. The economy is really about demand. Demand is, what do people want to buy? What do they want to spend money on? And if people have money and want to spend it, the economy does better. And if they don't have money and they don't want to spend it, the economy does worse. That's it. Anybody tells you anything else, they don't know what they're talking about. So the government spends money that increases demands for goods and services in the economy. Just think about the post office, which is a federal government agency, and the post office buys trucks. So if they buy trucks, then the people who make those trucks are selling more trucks, and then they have higher sales, and then they can pay the workers who build the trucks, and then those folks have more money and they spend more of it, and that helps stores and the people who make things that the stores sell, etc. So it filters on down the line. So we pay for that by taxes. Taxes are the price of civilization. You know, the only people I ever really hear complain about taxes are rich people, which makes zero sense to me. I swear to God, next time I'm out somewhere, I'm just going to reach out and slap some rich person when they say, oh, my taxes are too high. It's like, really? You live in a country that allowed you to become this rich and you're complaining about the fact that you have to contribute. Go home. So taxes redistribute wealth, and they also pay for things that markets can't provide on their own. So for example, anything that we can't make a profit off of, government has to provide. So that's roads and schools and transportation infrastructure and stoplights and stop signs and all kinds of things that we rely on. Markets won't provide those because, you know, you can't make a profit off a stop sign, so the market won't provide that. Government employment gives people jobs, and the federal government and governments at all levels employ millions of people doing things that people say they want. So government supports research and development. So we get new and better products in part because the government is subsidizing the research or doing it itself. And then, of course, government pays for education. Your tuition only pays for about 40% of what it costs you to go to college. The other money comes from the state, from Washington state. So that means that we get more people who are better educated, who are able to learn, who have skills, and that helps the productivity of the economy overall. So fiscal policy has a big impact. Now, taxes can be used for any number of reasons. We have taxes that discourage some kinds of activities, cigarette taxes, right? Because there's very little political resistance to raising taxes on cigarettes. Although every time the state raises taxes on cigarettes, more people quit smoking. So one of the things that's happening right now, that this is a problem you're going to have to confront. So in Washington state, for example, the gas tax is what funds transportation improvements. That's what pays for roads. And paying for roads means that goods and services and people and things can move. If you have a bad transportation network, economy doesn't work as well. Well, people now are buying electric cars and hybrids and cars that get better mileage, which means they're buying less gas, which means less gas tax. So probably what you'll see in your lifetime is just some kind of transportation charge to replace the gas tax or augment it, because it's not raising as much money as it used to. So, all right. So there's that. Let's see. Monetary policy is control of the money supply. I'm going to tell you a story. Try to listen, unlike last week. The money supply matters, right? If there's too much money in circulation, you can get inflation, which we'll talk about in a minute. If you don't have enough money in circulation, economic activity contracts because there just isn't enough cash floating around. So here's an example of that. There were a group of couples a few years back in Washington, D.C. They were all young couples. They were married. They had small children. And they decided, hey, let's form a babysitting co-op. And so they gave, every couple got 2 coupons, which you could exchange, which you could give to another couple and get a night of babysitting. The advantage being, well, there are people that we know and we trust, and we'll all work on this together. And in a very short time, they were going out even less than they had before. And the reason for that is that, look, this is an economy, right? It has a product, babysitting, it has consumers, the couples, and it has money. It has those babysitting coupons. Well, with only 2 coupons, nobody wanted to spend, right? Because if you went out one night and you paid a coupon, then you only had one left. And that seemed to be wrong. So then they increased the number of coupons. Well, they just printed a bunch of coupons, and pretty soon people weren't going out again. Everyone was willing to go out, but no one wanted to babysit because they all had enough coupons. So it took them several tries. Eventually they got to a level where that economy worked. So this is sort of a small scale example of why the money supply matters. Now, here's what you're going to hear in your lifetime: that we should go back to the gold standard, that was somehow better. The problem with that is there isn't enough gold, right? If the money supply relies on the amount of a commodity like gold, it simply shrinks the money supply and you don't have enough money. So when we were on the gold standard in the late 1800s, there was basically a depression from the 1870s to the 1890s because there wasn't enough money in circulation. So the money supply is managed by the Federal Reserve, and they have, in essence, some tools that they can use to increase or decrease the money supply. Almost every country has a central bank, and that's their job, is to manage the money supply. Now, you can't go to the Federal Reserve and open a checking account, okay? So even though it's a bank, it's not a commercial bank. And the president appoints the chair and the vice chair, and the other members of the 7-member board of the Federal Reserve are elected from the 12 regional boards. And you don't have to know that. What you have to understand is that this is what the Federal Reserve does. And they have an assignment, right? Their charter says they're going to do this. They're going to try to maintain long-term economic growth. So in any case, that means sort of more jobs and more money, and people live better lives. But they're also supposed to do that with low inflation. So think about this, understand this idea. If the Fed manages through pumping money into the economy, then and that manages to create economic growth, that raises demand. What's going to happen to prices then? If demand goes up, what happens to prices? This is pretty basic. Most people tend to get this. What happens to demand if prices go up? Well, I mean, what happens? Yeah, prices go up, demand falls. If demand goes up, so do prices. That's inflation. So the Fed has a very difficult balancing act. They could curb inflation, but that might mean that the economy doesn't grow. And since they are, in essence, a bunch of bankers, they tend to err on the side of, well, let's stop inflation because nothing hurts the banking industry so much as constantly rising prices. Here's the thing about monetary policy. It works, but it doesn't always work. So we could cut interest rates to near zero, but if people are worried about their jobs, it doesn't help, because if nobody's buying, nobody's borrowing. So by itself, it won't fix everything. It's important, and I'll give you some examples of that. So there's that. Now, regulation. Regulation attempts to address the shortcomings of the market, which is to say the stuff that markets don't fix by themselves. Markets are really good. So a capitalist economy, when I say markets, that's pretty much what I mean. A capitalist economy is really good at deciding what will be produced and how much it will cost. There's no better system for that. You know, people who say, well, we should be socialist. It's like, no, a planned economy has some real drawbacks, you know, and that's one of them. There's not enough of the goods that people want, and you can't really price them adequately. So regulation imposes both costs and benefits, right? So the benefits, which I think tend to get overlooked, people on the right, conservatives, tend to write as though there's nothing more than costs to being regulated. Look, if people get hurt less at work, right? Companies are more productive and there are lower healthcare costs. So health and safety regulations are actually really important. Wage regulations, you know, if there was no minimum wage, there are firms that would pay you almost nothing, because that's what used to happen. If there were not child labor laws, you know, people say, well, just, you know, people would just decide, they'd vote with their feet. Well, here's what happened in the 1800s. Children as young as 5 worked in factories, and they chained them to the machine so they wouldn't run away. I'm not making this up. So the people who say, well, we don't need any regulation, are just ignoring history. On the other hand, you know, for everything that we regulate, there is a cost, right? So there's a cost to being safer. There is an upfront cost. There's a long-term benefit. Obviously, I think that it makes more sense to have these kinds of regulations and keep people safe. Regulation is often sought by businesses to limit competition. There's a question in this exam, and you know, half the people in this class, especially the ones who aren't here, are going to get that question wrong because people don't pay attention and they don't read. So let me say that again. Regulation is often sought by businesses to limit competition, because if they limit competition, that means they get higher prices and more profits. So Smith Brothers Farms down here in South King County, great company. And big grocery stores were starting to get their butts kicked by dairies like that, because they provided better quality milk delivered to your house at a reasonable price. And so they got, this was during the George W. Bush years, one of my least favorite presidents, they got the Department of Agriculture to rule that everybody who produced milk, you couldn't basically produce milk and then sell it on your own. You had to sell your milk into a pool, and then everyone would buy from that. Well, if you did that, you couldn't guarantee that, you know, your milk wasn't pumped full of chemicals, etc. So Smith Brothers eventually found a dairy who supplies them now, but they had to get out of the dairy business. Basically, they still make all the products, but they can't make their own milk. So it worked out okay for them in the end. But that's what I'm talking about. That was simply a regulation to limit competition. because big grocery stores were not doing as well because they were getting beat by small producers who offered something that people wanted. There's something in the chat there, forgive me. Yes, I like Smith Brothers too. They're all right. So government regulates trade, environmental impacts, health and safety, working conditions. So all of those things tend to matter to people. The people who own businesses don't like that as much because it costs them money up front, although I would argue it saves them money in the long run. You can have too much regulation. There is no doubt. For 40 years, the airline industry was regulated and they could not basically raise or lower ticket prices without approval from the Federal Aviation Administration. It had a different name then. And flying was really expensive. When I was a kid, you didn't fly unless you were in business or you were really rich, which didn't describe most people I knew. I didn't fly until my father took a job overseas and we moved. So now flying is quite affordable. The thing of it is that when there's room for competition, you probably don't need as much regulation. Okay, you still need safety regulation, and Boeing is proof of that. But you don't necessarily need regulation if there's actual competition. So some people only see costs and some people only see benefits. There's both. You should understand that. All regulation's not bad. All regulation's not good. So now here's why we should care about this. Recessions. Please, for the love of God, write this down so you get this question right. A recession is 2 quarters or 6 months of economic contraction as measured by GDP, gross domestic product. That's all the stuff that the economy is producing, goods and services, the whole 9 yards. We still have the largest GDP on earth by a lot, even much bigger than China. So if the economy's shrinking, here's what happens. Something happens in the economy and firms begin to lay off workers because their sales are falling, and then people have less money and they start spending less money because they're concerned. You know, if you see your neighbors losing your job, or you just say you lose hours, right? You're no longer getting overtime. I mean, any one of these things can happen, and then people sort of rein in their spending habits and they stop buying stuff. You know, they don't buy new cars, they don't buy new clothes, they don't buy houses, I mean, or stuff to put in them, right? And so that echoes all the way down the economy. Every industry in which they're no longer buying stuff from, it has to lay off people because they're not making as much money and they're not selling as much stuff. So the economy shrinks and people live worse lives. So very early in your lives, we had the Great Recession, which was caused by gambling in the financial industry. It was not caused by people being too greedy, wanting to buy houses. So let's see, what causes recessions? Pay attention to this. It's also in the reading. A downturn in the business cycle, the bursting of bubbles. Here's how a bubble works. And you have lived through them without even knowing it. And I've lived through a bunch now. So somebody comes out with a new product, and it's a product that a bunch of people want because it has utility, it has value. So if we go back to here's the best example I can think of, late 90s. In the 90s, people started getting home computers. Now you've grown up with this, right? So this is not a big thing, but think of a world where there are no smartphones and very few home computers. And then people start to get them. Well, at that point in the market, sales are rising and profits are good and people are getting hired and they're making decent wages and they're going out and spending money and the economy is growing and everything looks rosy. And then at some point, this is going to happen to you. At some point, this is going to happen to you. At some point, somebody who's supposed to know better says we have reached a permanent place of posterity. I've heard that having watched this cycle happen multiple times in my life. And every time you hear somebody say that, you know that the bubble's about to burst, because nothing grows forever. Just nothing grows forever, except people's expectations, perhaps. And eventually the bubble bursts, because at some point, everybody who wants that product has it. And at that point, you're only selling at the replacement rate. So when nobody had a personal computer, everybody was buying them. But when everybody had a personal computer who wanted one, well, they might buy a new one if, you know, a better one comes out or their old one wears out or something. So that business contracts and they're not selling as much product and they start laying people off. And those people have less money, and so they start spending less money, and other people become worried about their jobs, so they start spending less money, and then the economy shrinks. And then what you hear is that the system is broken and we need to get rid of capitalism, and socialism is the only answer. I've lived through this multiple times too. We're like babies when it comes to this. Someday, any number of you will have children. And this is what will happen. Your child, whom you will love and take care of course, they'll hurt themselves, right? And when you have no experience with life, when you experience pain, and I watched this with my own daughters, right? They'd stub a toe or something like that, right? Fall over. You don't know that this pain doesn't last forever. And the sounds a child will make under those circumstances, you would think that demons are tearing out their very souls, even though it's only a stub toe, right? So when we live in this economy, when we see things growing, people tend to think this is what's going to happen forever. And when the economy is shrinking, people tend to think this is what's going to happen forever. And neither one of those things are true. So bubbles are a common cause of recession. Cuts in government spending. Remember, government spending is about 20% of the economy. 70% is consumer spending, 20% is government spending, and about 10% is business investment. So if you cut enough government spending, you would in fact produce a recession, because that would reduce demand. And that happened in 1969. Richard Nixon was president. He got Congress to balance the budget. Boom, we had a recession, just like that. Tight monetary policy. Remember, we said if not enough money is circulating in the economy, that can cause the economy to shrink. Well, in the early 80s, the Federal Reserve Board, inflation was very high, and they were determined to fight that. And so they raised interest rates. They raised interest rates to over 20%. And there's a number of tools they have to do that. So they can do that, right? And that just killed the housing market, which is about 25% of the economy. So in the early 80s, we had the steepest recession since the Great Depression. And I met people in the real estate industry who hadn't sold a house in 6 months, because if your mortgage interest rate is too high, you can't afford to buy a house. So when it's low, that's, you know, it's good for people then to buy houses. So eventually they bled inflation out of the economy, and eventually it recovered, but it was sharp and severe. Natural disasters throughout history. This is a big source of economic contraction. And I mean, this goes back thousands of years. If you look at history, you see that climate change, which is sort of always with us, in the past has caused all kinds of problems, because, you know, business can't happen and people can't raise crops and things don't work. So natural disasters can cause recessions as well. Now, in our time, these kinds of recessions have been localized, right? So Hurricane Katrina was not good for the economy of New Orleans, but it didn't kill the rest of the country. So things, if you want to worry about, if you lay awake late at night, is what happens if Mount Rainier erupts, because it's an active volcano. And There's geological evidence of mud flows from Mount Rainier's last eruption that reach all the way to Lake Washington. So we're living on the edge of interesting things. So that would cause, yeah, at least a recession, right? So what ends recessions? This is important to understand. Gains in productivity. There are only two sources of economic growth: gains in productivity and gains in population. Anything else is nana. That's it. And gains in productivity means output per worker. All right. So if a worker is able to put out more product in the same amount of time, then that means they're more productive. And here's what happens in recessions, right? Firms lay off people. The people who are left are expected to pick up the slack. So by definition, they become more productive. Under those circumstances, firms tend to do better. And as they do a little bit better, then they're in a position to say, we could spend a little more and we could sell a little more if we did this. And then they're able to do that. Let me check the chat field here. Yes, they were. So that brings us really to upturns in the business cycle. So unless a firm goes out of business, and the firms that go out of business in a recession are the ones that were not terribly efficient to begin with. So the firms that survive are by definition more efficient and smarter, and they do better. And they're still selling some product, right? Because sales haven't gone away entirely. They've just fallen some. And at some point, the firms that are selling, they have inventory. And as their inventory begins to fall, they start thinking, we're running out of this. Maybe we should order some more. And so orders begin to pick up. And then the firms that are producing and selling to the retailers, well, now they have to produce more stuff. So they need to buy more inputs. And so the economy begins to cycle upwards. There's nothing wrong and everything right with this. The problem is this can take 20 years. The Great Depression lasted for at least 12 years. It didn't end until World War II, when the government was forced to do what it probably should have done all along, which was just go out and spend a bunch of money, got the economy moving again. And finally, expansionary monetary policy. Now, the thing to remember about this is that in the middle of a recession, monetary policy by itself won't make that big of a difference. Because if nobody's buying, nobody's borrowing. I mean, that's the easiest way to think of that. So in the Great Recession, which happened when you were very young, the Fed had interest rates near zero. Right? I mean, borrowing was incredibly cheap, but who's going to borrow if they're not selling anything? And certainly, if you're worried about your job, you're not going to go out and take out a bunch of loans because, hey, am I going to have a job to pay for that? So it's not by itself a bad thing, but by itself, it may not work. So that much we know, I think, anyway. Now, inflation. This is another thing. And now you're seeing a little bit of inflation in the economy. Inflation is an increase in the average level of prices. It can be caused by shortages of goods, leading to prices being bid higher in the market. So here's what's happening right now. We have shortages, and one of the biggest shortages we have is labor. So everybody had to stay home for a year or work from home, and business contracted, and some things got sold and some things didn't. But think of it this way. We've lost almost 1 million people to COVID, and some of those were people who were actively in the labor market, right? They were working. So there's the start of a shortage of labor. I saw a comic a few weeks back who said some people say COVID's a hoax. He said, well, we should probably go dig up all those people who died from it and tell them they were wrong. So other people sort of closer to my age, not working, they finally decided, you know what? I'm not going back to work. And so people didn't. Right. So we lost a bunch of workers that way. And then workers, God bless them, I think they're right, started demanding higher wages. And because there was a shortage of labor, firms had to pay more to get labor. And so people keep leaving their jobs to go to other jobs to make more money. There's nothing wrong with that. As much as employers complain about that, it's like, really? I don't want to work for $10 an hour making you billions. I think I'm going to work somewhere else. So that's what's causing inflation now. I was talking to somebody the other day. He runs a juice business. You know, they have some stores, and he said that, you know, the prices of things that they're buying are rising, and the biggest thing is that, you know, he went down to the warehouse and they had like 6 trucks there, and the trucks were full of stuff, but they had nobody working who could unload them. So that's the situation that we face now. So firms are going to simply have to pay more if they want to attract workers. And of course, that will be reflected somewhat in higher costs. So inflation can be caused by a higher level of demand. So you can have a shortage of supply, or you can have a higher level of demand. If something becomes more popular, more people want to buy it. This will always be amazing to me. In the late 70s, somehow denim, blue jeans, became a fashion item. And a whole bunch of people got into this business, firms that are no longer with us. And everyone was buying fashion jeans and denim jackets and stuff. And honestly, it wasn't a good look. But anyway, the price of jeans went through the roof because, you know, all of a sudden this was the clothing item that everybody had to have. And then eventually that fad passed and the prices moderated again. So inflation makes business planning difficult. It's really unsettling. When I lived in times of high inflation, you feel helpless. You know, your savings are being eroded, your investments aren't returning as much, and everything costs more when you go to the store every week. And that's when we had that monetary recession in the early 80s, because the Federal Reserve said, okay, I mean, people were so crazy about this. On the Tonight Show, the host then was Johnny Carson, and one night he made a joke in his monologue at the beginning, and he said, have you heard about the latest shortage? Toilet paper. And the next day there was a shortage of toilet paper because people heard this and they believed it, and they went to the stores and they bought stuff up. Same thing happened with, I think, paper towels and some other paper products at the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, people just went crazy. So consumer expectations can play a big role in that. So inflation is a problem that will frequently sort itself out, although it's not fun to watch. So as prices rise, more firms enter the market because they say, hey, prices are going up. We get into this business and make money. And when that happens, supply increases. And when supply increases, prices will fall. So that happened with oil in the 70s and 80s. Sources of oil that previously were too expensive to get out of the ground, all of a sudden it became economical to do that. You could spend all that money and pump the oil out of the bottom of the North Sea. I mean, they drill for oil a mile down from floating oil derricks that have to have motors on all sides of them to keep them from moving, so that the drilling shaft doesn't snap. I mean, think about how expensive that must be. Well, higher oil prices made that economical, probably, unfortunately. Same thing with oil shale in Colorado, well, or oil sands in Alberta. It's really expensive to turn that stuff into oil. But if oil prices are high enough, you can do it and make money, and then somebody will. And as a consequence, then oil prices moderated and became relatively cheap. As prices rise, substitutes may become available, also driving down prices. So if we go back to the early 2000s, or yeah, about then, I may have my dates wrong there, but in my lifetime, not yours. At one point, General Motors was selling Hummers, and they were selling 100,000 Hummers a year. And Toyota had launched the Prius, and they were only selling about 20,000 a year. And then the price of gasoline rose, and those numbers flipped, and now they don't even make Hummers anymore because nobody wants to buy that. So substitutes mean that people will pay less for things that they don't want as much, and instead they'll buy the substitute. So government policy may decrease demand by cutting spending or raising interest rates. That can lower inflation. The problem there is that, of course, that means fewer people have jobs and fewer people are making money. So there's a big trade-off there. Sometimes it has to happen, but I would hope that's sort of a last resort. Forgot what I was going to say. So a question that often comes up is, so a recession, 2 quarters of economic contraction, what's a depression? There's no formal definition of a depression. There's a joke. A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job. So depression was a term that they came up to replace the previous term, which was panic. They used to call these things panics, and then in the Great Depression, they decided, well, we'll call it a depression. So no formal definition there. All right. Friends, do you have questions? I do hope you will do the reading. These last 3 exams include a lot of material where you just aren't going to get this stuff off the internet. And I really hope that people don't write the opposite of what I've just said. So clearly, you have to be able to explain what a recession is and what causes them and what fixed them. And you also have to be able to explain in at least basic terms, how does the government intervene in the economy? And by that, we may, the government wants the economy to be strong so that people have jobs. I mean, that's one of the things governments at all levels want. They want people to have jobs because that means people need fewer social services, their lives are better, their kids get more attention, all that kind of stuff. And then government gets the revenue to provide the services that people want. Sky, you have a question. You're going to have to unmute yourself there.
So maybe I'm wrong, but are recessions just kind of like, it's a widespread panic? If we realize this, why don't people just kind of ignore it and continue as they were before?
In 1982, I got laid off from a job. Should I have just ignored that?
No.
That's it. Yeah, they're real. You can't just ignore them. They're real. I mean, yes, it would be a less of a recession if everyone started spending like they did before. But, really, if you see people losing their jobs, you have to think about that. You could be next. And so it's a perfectly understandable reaction to an uncertain economy for people to sort of say, well, maybe this is the time to buy a new car. Right? I mean, you don't quit your job and buy a new car. That makes no sense. So it's the reason you can't ignore them is that they have an impact on everybody's life. Even if you're not affected directly, you're affected indirectly. The only people who don't get affected by recessions are the very rich. So high-end jewelry and clothing stores and, Porsche dealerships tend to do fine in recessions because their customers still have money. The rest of us, not so much. In places where I have worked when the economy hasn't been doing well, it's like, well, we don't get bonuses anymore, right? We can't do overtime because we no longer have the budget for that. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, good. That's a good question. I thought the same thing. When I was your age and I was just a beginning college student, and my livelihood wasn't directly tied to the economy at that point because you're a student, right? And you kind of think, well, why is everybody so worked up about this? Well, get out in the real world and you'll see why. And there will be others. There's the thing about there will be another recession, and anybody who tells you otherwise has no idea what they're talking about. They're just not predictable. People who say that they know, well, the market's going to crash or this is going to happen. They don't know. I've read lots of these people and it's like, no, they're never right. And if they are right, it's like, well, even a stopped clock is right twice a day, right? I mean, so I've read people who's just like, the coming contractions. Well, yeah, there will be, but you don't know when and you don't know why. So right now people are nervous about the war in Ukraine and so they're a little cautious with spending and whatnot, and it may impact global trade. But the biggest problem that we face is still really echoes from the pandemic. And even that labor market shortage problem will sort itself out. So good question. Other questions? Anything you need me to go over again? You're smart people. If you pay attention, you're going to do fine. And everybody's going to pass. So that's good. No
So
more?
is there,
Go
oh,
ahead.
sorry.
No, go
Is
ahead.
there a way to navigate depression, or do you just kind of have to wait until it?
Yeah. On a personal level, well, this is why financial advisors say, budget, right? If you're spending more than you're making, well, that's a problem. So it took me forever to figure this out. I wish I had figured it sooner. I think the real key is one, banking at a credit union, because you get higher interest rates and they charge you less. And then two, if you have a job, and most people I suspect now get some kind of direct deposit from their employer, set up a savings account and have some tiny amount of money taking from your checking account in to go automatically into your savings account every month. I mean, $5-10 literally. And the advantage of that is that will pile up and grow over time. And eventually you'll have more money. And then you'll have money. And this is what, on a personal finance level, I mean, you should have money set aside if something unexpected happens. Your car blows up and you have to do something, right? Or something breaks in your house, or I mean, whatever that is, if you have money set aside, then you can cover those expenses without having to, say, use a credit card and be paying high interest rates. So the only thing I think you can do is sort of practice prudent money management, and just presume at some point I'm going to need to do this. So my credit union, I have a savings account, but they also have a Christmas club, right? So I have money going in there every month so that at the end of the year I have money for presents. And they have a vacation account. So I have money going in there. So if I decide to take a vacation, well, I don't have to charge that. I can just dip into that account. So automatic deductions are the best way. When I was first working, I thought, okay, I'm going to put money in savings every month. Well, of course you forget, and then you spend the money. So when you're starting out, you may not be making very much. I hope that you all make gobs of money when you get out of college, but if you're not, you gotta plan. So having it done automatically. The other thing everybody should do is go home today and go to your financial institution and open an individual retirement account and have money going into that every month, no matter how little. Because even though, 16, 17, 18, 19, I mean, however old you are, retirement seems just so terribly far away. But the point is if you save for it for the next 40 years, you'll have a lot more money in the end. And you'll be able to retire comfortably. And, you don't want to retire into poverty. You want to be able to enjoy yourself. So start putting money away now. Like I said, it doesn't have to be very much. You shouldn't save more than you can afford to save. But if you start now, it really builds up. You get compounding interest. It's sort of like the problem with credit card debt is if you're not paying it off, pretty soon you're paying interest on the interest. Well, with savings, you're getting interest on the interest. So that can be very helpful. I highly recommend that. Other questions? Okay. So the mask mandate is coming off March 12th, but the governor has not said anything about requirements for higher ed. The college just sent out an email about that they haven't made any decisions, and they're talking to folks and trying to figure out what we're going to do. I'll be surprised if we don't just stay with masks for the rest of the quarter. What are people feeling? Do we want to meet live again? Are you feeling better about that? If you're not, it's okay. You just don't want to come in, that's okay too. I like being home on Thursday mornings. I still got to go in on Tuesdays. And if you don't have any thoughts about that, that's all right too. So look, you've got this economics chapter. You really got to read this, and do take notes when you read. You know, if you just guess, that won't go well. It's mostly the people who aren't here who need to hear this as usual, but that's all right. The next chapter is about international relations, and there are very specific things there that you need to understand. We will talk about that next week. And then the last chapter, Three Problems, is about debt and water and climate change, which is real and man-made, whether you believe in it or not. This is the issue of your lifetimes. And it's a serious problem. Remember what I just said earlier about how climate change has impacted human history before. There are a couple times in the 6th century and in the 14th century where the bubonic plague sort of invaded Europe, and it killed people. You know, in the 14th century, it may have killed half the population of Europe. Well, the other thing that was going on there was climate change, right? In the 6th century, a super volcano in El Salvador blew up and covered the earth with ash and sulfur dioxide. And so they spent a whole year without summer, basically. And that meant that crops were not being grown and people were not being fed. So when the plague came, they were more likely to die because they were already malnourished. Well, the same thing happened in the 14th century. The cycle of the earth moving around the sun meant that we were a little farther away, and so it got colder, and so they weren't raising much food. And then the plague showed up on a ship that landed in Italy and spread all over Europe, and like I said, killed half the population. Well, people were already malnourished frequently under those circumstances, and so they were more susceptible to disease. So if we cannot limit the amount of greenhouse gases that we're pumping into the atmosphere, then temperatures will rise, and that will mean lots of flooding. And as we've already seen, more extreme weather. We used to call this global warming. Now we say climate change, because it's not just everything is indeed getting warmer, but we're also getting greater extremes. And that interferes with everything. The Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, those brilliant people, they did a study, and their study concluded that it wouldn't affect anything. Climate change wouldn't affect anything except food production. And I'm like, hello, is there anything more basic? If you don't have enough food, you die. That's it. So, and the oil industry has known about this since the 1970s. I mean, their old scientists were telling them, you know what, we're putting too much carbon in the atmosphere, and they didn't want to change that. My take in the chapter is that we're just doing this the wrong way. So trying to regulate our way out of this produces political resistance, because people have to make a living, right? And people look at this as like, well, if we do things to limit climate change, then I'm not going to be able to make a living. So my thought is, look, pay people to stop doing things we don't want them to do. Go to the oil companies and the coal companies and the miners and the oil workers and say, okay, we're going to give you a pile of money. Stop that. Because politically speaking, I think that would be easier. That's just me. And, what do I know, right? What I know, $2 and a coupon will get you a latte. Water is a serious issue. And then, of course, in there, we talk about budget deficits and why they matter and they don't matter. So anyway, do read that stuff. If you have questions, you can always reach me by email. We can even Zoom, whatever we need to do. Anything else? Anything else I can help you with? Like I said, you're going to pass. And if you put a little effort in, you'll do even better. So we're out of time. You're all great Americans. I'm glad to be with you again this week. I'll see you next Thursday. Let me know how it's going. And be well. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool.
You too.